Margaret Holcomb came down the stairs at 6:15 on a Wednesday morning in January, the way she had come down those same stairs for 31 years. Right hand on the rail, weight on the outside of each step because the third one from the bottom creaked, and she had never fixed it, and somewhere along the way, she had stopped meaning to. She was wearing the blue flannel robe she had owned for 12 years, and the wool socks her daughter Claire had sent from Denver 2 Christmases ago. The ones with the reinforced heel that she had told Claire were unnecessary, and then worn almost every morning since. She expected the smell of coffee. There was no smell of coffee. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs and stood in the hallway and breathed in through her nose the way a person does when checking the air for something they cannot name. The house smelled of nothing. Cold radiator metal and old wood, and the faint cedar from the closet near the front door. Nothing cooking, nothing warming, nothing that meant another person had been awake before her. She walked to the kitchen. The coffee pot on the counter was clean. Not empty clean the way it was when Robert had made a pot and left the last cup in it until it burned. Clean, clean. Rinsed and set back in its cradle with the lid open, the way someone sets a thing they are not planning to use again. The kitchen was cold in a way that told her the back door had been open at some point in the night and the heat had not caught up yet. The clock above the stove read 6:16. She saw the note. It was folded in half and propped against the salt shaker in the center of the kitchen table, and for a moment that was the most ordinary thing in the world because Robert had always left notes that way, propped against the salt shaker, when he was running out early for a job site, or when he had written down something he wanted her to find. She crossed to the table and picked it up with one hand and unfolded it with her thumb. 8 words. She read them. She set the paper down on the table. She picked it up again and read them again, and this time she read each word separately, not as a sentence, but as 8 individual facts. And then she set it down once more and pulled the chair out from the table and sat down in it with her back straight and her hands flat on her thighs. She looked out the kitchen window. The yard was dark. The oak at the back fence was a black shape against a slightly less black sky. There was no wind. The bird feeder she had built from cedar scraps 3 summers ago was a small square silhouette against the fence line. She had filled it 4 days ago. She could not tell from where she sat whether anything had eaten from it. She sat like that for 4 minutes, not frozen, not in shock, sitting the way a person sits when doing the accounting of a situation before deciding what to do about it. She had been a high school mathematics teacher for 29 years, and she had learned in that time that panic was a luxury, and that the only useful response to any problem was to look at it clearly and take the next step. She got up. She walked through the house with the lights off because she knew every room well enough, and because turning lights on felt like something she was not ready to do yet, some admission that the morning was real and had started. She went to the bedroom first. Their bedroom. She turned on the light in the closet and stood in the doorway. His side was half empty. Not ransacked, not pulled apart. Carefully half empty. The remaining clothes had been pushed to the left to fill the space the way you would push things over if you were trying to make a room look less depleted. The hangers he had taken were gone. The ones he had left were pushed together neatly. There was a pair of shoes on the floor that were not the right pair to take if you were taking shoes, the dress shoes he wore to church that were worn through at the inner sole, and that he had been meaning to replace since last Easter. The shelf above his side held a gap where the brown leather overnight bag had lived for 20 years. She walked to the dresser. His watch case was gone. The top drawer where he kept his everyday things, the money clip his father had given him, the pocket square he never actually used, but always meant to that drawer, was empty and clean, not a single cufflink left on the liner. She went to the living room. She stood in front of the fireplace and looked at the mantel. The photograph was gone. The one from Yellowstone, the summer Claire turned 12. The 3 of them squinting into the sun with the lower falls behind them. Claire's arm around both her parents. Margaret looking at something off to the left of the camera, the way she always did in photographs, Robert with his eyes fully open, and his smile that was better in photographs than it was in person. The nail was still in the wall. The square of paint behind where the frame had hung was a slightly different shade of cream than the rest of the wall cleaner, protected from 30 years of dust and light. She went to the garage. His truck was gone. The space where it had been held a small oil stain on the concrete that he had been meaning to clean up since September. The tool chest against the wall, the red metal one he had bought himself for his 50th birthday and polished every spring, was gone. The miter saw was gone. The plastic bin of bronze fittings he had been saving for a project he kept saying he would get to was gone. She stood in the empty space where his truck had been and looked at the oil stain for a moment, and then she went back inside. She called the bank at 8 minutes before 7 in the morning, earlier than the hours printed on the website. But the line connected and a woman answered with the careful brightness of someone reading from a script. Margaret told her her name. She told her she needed to check on the accounts. The woman asked for her date of birth, asked for her mother's maiden name. She gave her both. The woman asked her to hold. The hold music was something with a piano that kept resolving to the same 4 notes over and over. Margaret stood at the kitchen counter with one hand on the edge of the sink and listened to it for what the clock told her was 90 seconds. The woman came back on the line and her voice had changed. Not unkind, careful. The joint checking account held 38 cents. Margaret asked about the savings. Closed when? 47 hours ago. She asked about the money market account. Closed, the certificate of deposit. Surrendered, the woman said with a pause. The early withdrawal penalty was waived because she said and stopped and then said the signature on file authorized it. Margaret thanked her and ended the call. She stood at the sink and turned on the tap and ran her hands under cold water and watched the water move around her fingers. She was 62 years old, and she had been a mathematics teacher for 29 years, and she had balanced every household account they had ever owned. And in that time, she had never once found a number that surprised her because numbers did not lie, and she had always known how to read them. She turned off the water. She was drying her hands on the dish towel when the thump came from the front porch. She opened the door. A FedEx envelope, thick padded, leaning against the screen door. Addressed to her from a real estate closing firm in Sarasota, Florida. She did not know the name. She brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table and cut it open with a butter knife. Inside was a closing packet, 17 pages. The sale of this house, 242 Birchwood Lane, Columbus, Ohio. Sale price $420,000. Buyer a couple from Scottsdale, Arizona, whose name she had never heard. Closing date 11 days from today. She turned to the page with the signatures. The seller authorization line bore her name in what was meant to be her handwriting. She looked at it for a long time. She knew her own signature the way she knew her own voice, not by studying it, but by having made it 10,000 times. And what she was looking at was a close copy made by someone who had practiced, but who had gotten the M slightly wrong. The first loop of it came down too far to the left, and the final T in Holcomb crossed at the wrong angle. Someone had sat somewhere with a piece of paper and practiced her signature until they thought they had it right, and they had almost had it right. She set the packet down on the table. She put on her coat and her boots and her gloves and drove to the Columbus Police Department. The desk officer on duty was a man in his 30s who listened to her without interrupting and then went and got his supervisor, a sergeant in his 50s, with a hairline that had retreated to the center of his head and eyes that had seen this kind of morning before. The sergeant read the closing packet. He read the note Margaret had brought from the kitchen table, still propped in its original fold, the 8 words still visible through the paper. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her the way a doctor looks at a patient, when the diagnosis is straightforward, but the prognosis requires some care in the telling. When a spouse walks out, he said the walking out itself is not a criminal matter for us. That is a divorce attorney's jurisdiction. But the signature, he said, and tapped the closing packet, if that signature is not yours, that is forgery. That is a criminal matter that we can move on. It is not mine, Margaret said. Look at the M. The sergeant looked. He looked for a long time. He asked her to write her name 3 times on the back of a notepad. He compared the two. His expression did not change, but something behind it did. He would send an officer to the house that afternoon, he said. They would need photographs of everything that was missing. They would need a list. He was sorry. She should call a lawyer today. Margaret thanked him and drove home and sat in the driveway for a moment with the engine idling. Then she called her daughter. Claire picked up on the third ring. She was at her desk in Denver. Margaret could tell by the particular quality of the silence behind her voice, the soundproofed quiet of the open-plan office Claire had described once and complained about and never mentioned again. Mom, Claire said, using the word with the casual ease of someone expecting a short call. "Your father is gone," Margaret said. A pause. "Gone where I don't know. He took the money. He sold the house." There was a note. The pause this time was longer. The kind of pause that is not confusion, but rather the postponement of understanding. "Mom, that doesn't. He wouldn't. Are you sure you read it right? Have you tried calling him?" "His phone is off. I have been trying since before I called the bank." The bank. "The accounts are at 38 cents, Claire. The savings is closed. The CD is cashed out. There is a closing packet on the kitchen table from a firm in Florida for the sale of this house, with a signature that is supposed to be mine and is not mine." Another pause. Longer. Mom, Claire said finally, and the word landed differently than it had the first time. I don't want to jump to anything. Dad doesn't do this. There has to be something else going on." "His truck is gone," Margaret said. "His tools are gone. The accounts are at 38 cents. What else is there to explain?" Another silence. Then Claire said I should come. "Let me come. Give me a few days," Margaret said. "Let me see what I can find first." "Mom, please don't do anything until I can get there. I'll call you tonight." She ended the call before Claire could hear what was in her voice. She did not call Claire back when the officer arrived at 2 in the afternoon and took photographs of the empty closet and the blank space above the fireplace and the clean coffee pot and the oil stain in the garage. She did not call her back when the officer paused in the doorway before leaving and told her that he had called the title company and that the sale was legally binding unless a court order could be obtained before the 11th, and that she needed a lawyer this week, and that he was sorry. Margaret thanked him and closed the door and turned the deadbolt, which she had not turned during the day in years, because Robert had always said the neighborhood was safe and there was no point. She made a sandwich and ate half of it standing at the kitchen sink. Then she did something she had not done since the week after her father's funeral. She opened the door to the basement. The stairs were wooden painted gray, the same gray they had been painted when she and Robert moved into this house 22 years ago. She went down slowly, not because she was uncertain of the steps, but because the basement held the particular quality of stillness that certain places hold when you have not been in them in a long time. And the stillness has had years to settle into something thicker than air. She walked past the shelving unit with the holiday boxes, past the water heater Robert had replaced himself 4 years ago, past the work table he had built against the south wall, past the 2 folding chairs stacked in the corner and the electric space heater that had never fully worked, all the way to the back, to the far wall where a steel filing cabinet stood in the corner under an old drop cloth. She pulled the cloth off. The cabinet was 4 drawers gunmetal gray, the kind built in another decade for people who expected things to last. Her father's handwriting was on each drawer in the small, precise block letters Arthur had used for everything, a style of lettering Margaret remembered from grocery lists and Christmas cards, and the handwritten estimates he had given customers before he upgraded to a carbon copy pad from the hardware store in town. The labels read taxes, correspondence, property, personal. Margaret had moved this cabinet from Maine to Columbus after Arthur's funeral. She had arranged for it to be transported in a rented van alongside the few other things she had taken from the house he had kept, and she had brought it to the basement and set it here and put the cloth over it and told herself she would go through it when she was ready. She had not been ready. She pulled the handle of the property drawer. The drawer was organized the way Arthur organized everything, which was to say it was organized the way a mind that does not tolerate ambiguity organizes things. Manila folders, each one labeled in black felt-tip marker, arranged alphabetically. She walked her fingers across the tops of the folders, reading each label. There were deeds and surveys and insurance documents for things she had not known her father owned. A lot in Vermont he had apparently purchased and sold in 1987. A storage unit in Bangor lapsed, a half interest in a boat slip she could not place. And near the back of the drawer, a folder labeled Stillwater Lake Boathouse, Harwick, Me. She pulled it out. She carried it upstairs. She sat down at the kitchen table with it in front of her and set both hands on it for a moment before she opened it. Inside were three things. The first was the deed to a property in Harwick, Maine on Stillwater Lake. The deed was dated 35 years ago, the year after Margaret and Robert were married. It was made out in Margaret's name only. Not Robert Holcomb, not Margaret and Robert Holcomb. Margaret Ann Holcomb, solely and without encumbrance. She set it down on the table and looked at it. The second thing was a brass key on a leather fob. The key was old-style, larger than a modern key, with a square shank and a simple blade. The leather of the fob was dry and dark and had been handled many times. She held it in her palm. The third thing was a white envelope, business-size, sealed. Her name was written across the front in Arthur's careful block letters. Margaret Ann Holcomb, with a period after each word, the way her father always wrote proper names, as if they were headings for important documents. She did not open the envelope. She sat at the kitchen table in the kitchen that was no longer going to be her kitchen in 11 days, and she looked at the deed and the key and the sealed envelope and the closed folder, and she thought about Arthur. She thought about the summer she was 9, and Arthur had let her help recaulk the seams on a 20-foot sloop at the boatyard in Portland, handing her strips of caulking cotton and a wooden mallet, and showing her how to drive the cotton into the seam with 3 taps, not 4 and never 2. She thought about the way Arthur's hands had looked working on a wooden hull, the hands of a man who had learned early that the work itself was a form of conversation, that you could say more with a properly set plank than with a paragraph, that a thing built correctly would outlast any explanation you might give for building it. She thought about the last time she had been to Maine. Claire was 14. They had driven up for a long weekend in September, and Arthur had cooked bass. He caught the morning they arrived, and they had eaten on the screened porch of the small house he kept in town, and then driven out to the lake, and Arthur had spent most of the day in the upper workshop, while Margaret sat on the dock with Claire, and they fished for 2 hours without catching anything significant and did not mind. When they left, Arthur had stood at the end of the gravel driveway with his hands in his pockets and watched the car go. He had not waved. Margaret had watched him in the rearview mirror until the trees took him. She had told herself for years that the not waving was Arthur being distant, being the man he had always been, the man who stood outside the ordinary exchanges of affection as if he had not been given the instruction for them. Sitting now at the kitchen table in the house that was not going to be her house in 11 days. Margaret looked at the sealed envelope with her name on it and wondered if the not waving had not been distance at all, if it had been something else entirely, something that a man who communicated through the setting of planks and the fitting of bronze cleats would have no other way to show. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Claire. She let it ring. She looked at the deed again and the key on the leather fob, and then she stood up and walked to the window and stood there until the phone stopped. She went upstairs. She pulled the 2 large duffel bags from the shelf in the closet. She packed them methodically. 3 changes of practical clothes, 2 flannels, her rain jacket, the good one she had bought 5 years ago, and used maybe 4 times but kept maintained because you did not let good gear go to waste. Wool socks, her blood pressure medication, the allergy pills she took in spring, the ibuprofen she took too many of, her toiletry bag. She went back down to the kitchen and took the coffee pot from its cradle and wrapped it in a dish towel and put it in the paper bag she kept under the sink. She was not going to leave her coffee pot for a couple from Scottsdale she had never met. From the hall closet, she took the heavy wool blanket she had bought at a surplus sale in 2009 and never put on a bed, because Robert said it was too scratchy, but which she had kept because it was a good blanket that would last another 40 years if she let it. She folded it and set it by the front door. She went to the bookshelf in the study. On the bottom shelf behind a row of paperbacks she had read and meant to donate, and never had was a flat wooden box about the size of a hardcover book, the kind that had once held a set of technical drawing instruments. She pulled it out and opened it. Inside, wrapped in a piece of old chamois, were the three things she had kept from Arthur's workshop after the funeral. A small block plane, the iron still sharp. A folding ruler of this kind no one used anymore, brass-fitted, the numbers worn down at the most commonly used measurements. And a folding penknife with a bone handle that Arthur had used for everything from cutting cord to sharpening pencils to cleaning his fingernails at the kitchen table during conversations he was not sure how to participate in. Margaret put the box in the duffel. She set the manila folder from Arthur's filing cabinet on the kitchen table on top of her keys so that she would not forget it in the morning. She looked at the sealed envelope inside it for a moment. She closed the folder. She went to bed. She slept for a little over 4 hours. She was awake at 4 in the morning the way she had been awake at 4 on school mornings for 29 years, not because of an alarm, not slowly but fully, and at once with the day already organized in her head before she sat up. She dressed in the dark. She made coffee using the backup pot she kept in the cabinet above the refrigerator. She filled the good thermos from the shelf, the 20-ounce one that held heat for 7 hours. She ate 2 pieces of toast standing at the counter. She loaded the car methodically, both duffel bags, the blanket, the coffee pot and its dish towel, the wooden box with Arthur's tools, the folder from the property drawer with the deed and the brass key, and the sealed envelope she was not ready to open. She went back through the house once. She walked through the living room and looked at the empty space above the fireplace, the nails still in the plaster, the paler square of cream-colored paint behind where the frame had been. She looked at it for a few seconds. She did not take the nail out. She walked through the kitchen and stood at the back door. The yard was still dark. The bird feeder was a shadow against the fence. She had filled it 4 days ago and would not be here to fill it again for some time. She locked the back door and the front door and got in the car. The neighborhood was dark and very quiet. She backed down the driveway and onto the street and drove away from the house on Birchwood Lane without looking at it in the rearview mirror. She drove. The interstate was light in the way it is, only in the hour before the morning commute fills it in. And she put the cruise control on 68 and set her coffee in the cup holder and drove through the pre-dawn dark of central Ohio while the heater did its work and the road unrolled ahead of the headlights. By the time she reached the Pennsylvania border, the sky had begun to change. Not sunrise, not yet, but the deep black turning to a dark blue that meant the dark was beginning to lose its argument with the morning. She stopped for gas outside of Pittsburgh and topped off the tank and went inside and bought a second coffee she did not need and a paper map of Maine. She found a motel outside of State College, a quality inn with a half-empty lot and a light on in the office. The room was what it was: carpet the color of old mustard, a painting of a covered bridge above the headboard, the smell of industrial cleaning solution, and the faint ghost of someone else's cigarette from years before the smoking ban. She set the duffel on the luggage stand and took off her boots and lay down on the bed with her clothes on. She put the folder with Arthur's documents on the nightstand beside her. She looked at the ceiling for a few minutes. She slept. At 3 in the morning, she came awake. She lay still and looked at the ceiling and listened to the room. The heater cycled on with a tick and a low roar and then found its temperature and went quiet again. A truck passed on the interstate, its sound Dopplering through the dark and fading. She had woken because the door of the room had opened, or she had dreamed that it had, and for the 3 seconds between sleep and full consciousness, her mind had placed Robert on the other side of it. He had gone out for something, and now he was coming back. She lay still while her mind corrected itself. And then a thing happened that she had not expected. She realized she was not surprised. She lay in the dark of the motel room outside of State College, Pennsylvania, and she examined that realization the way she had examined equations her students brought to her that seemed wrong at first glance, but proved on careful inspection to be true. She was not surprised that Robert had left. She was not surprised that he had taken the money. She was not surprised that the life they had built together had turned out to contain a version of Robert she had not been permitted to see clearly. What surprised her lying in that motel bed at 3 in the morning was the recognition that the surprise was absent. Because what that meant was that some part of her had known. had been knowing for a long time, had registered certain things in certain years and filed them under categories she never reopened, the way a teacher who cannot face a failing student will mark the papers and say nothing and tell herself there is still time. There had not been time, or there had been time and she had not used it. The distinction she thought did not matter much at 3 in the morning in a motel room in Pennsylvania with 38 cents in a joint account and 11 days before strangers took the house. She did not sleep again that night. She lay on the motel bed and listened to the interstate, and at 5 in the morning she got up and washed her face and made the weak motel coffee and drank it standing up. She checked out at 5:30 and was back on the road in the dark. The second day was long. She drove through Pennsylvania and into New York in a flat gray light, the interstate running along a river she could not name from the road broad and cold and the color of lead. She stopped for gas in a town with one stoplight. She stopped for lunch at a diner outside of Albany and ordered something and ate about half of it. The woman who refilled her coffee cup asked if everything was all right, and she said yes and left a tip larger than the check. She crossed into Vermont in the mid-afternoon. The hills came up around her, the bare-limbed hardwoods on the ridgelines giving way to spruce and fir. As she went north, the snow and the shadows deeper and less patchy than it had been in Ohio. She called Claire from a rest area near the Vermont-New Hampshire border, standing outside the car in the cold with her collar up. Claire answered on the first ring. "Mom, where are you?" "Vermont," Margaret said. "Vermont." "Maine," Claire said, understanding arriving in the single word. "You're driving to Maine, to the Boathouse. The deed is in my name. Only mine. I'm going to go look at it." A pause. Then Claire quietly, "I talked to 3 different people Dad knows today. Nobody has heard from him, and his phone still goes straight to voicemail." "I know," Margaret said. There was a long silence between them, the kind that is not empty, but full of things that are not ready to be said yet. Then Claire said, "I should come with you." "Give me a few days," Margaret said. "Let me see what's out there first." Her daughter was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. "Mom, you call me." "I will." She crossed into Maine at sundown, the sky behind her still holding the last orange of it over the western hills. The pavement wet and black and reflecting the headlights in long broken streaks. The trees on either side thickening to spruce and cedar. The road signs getting fewer and the towns getting smaller. And the feeling of the country changing in some way she could feel in her chest before she could have named it. She had not been to Maine since Claire was 14. She had not been to Harwick in longer than that. She missed the turn on the county road twice. The third time she saw the small wooden sign nailed to a pine tree, hand-routed letters so faded they were barely darker than the wood behind them. Stillwater. An arrow pointing left. The car rocked onto a gravel spur that had not been graded recently, the ruts deep from the freeze-thaw cycle of early spring branches scraping both sides of the car as she crept along in low gear. The odometer read 3/4 of a mile when the trees opened. And there was the lake. It was the color of old pewter under a low sky stretching away from her in both directions, further than she could see in the failing light. The far shore a dark line of spruce barely distinguishable from the sky above it. No other lights visible, no other structures, no sounds but the engine. And when she killed it, the deep and particular silence of a lake in early March, when the ice is going out but not yet gone, when the water holds itself in that suspended state between seasons. On the near shore at the end of the gravel spur, the boathouse stood. It was 2 stories built right at the waterline, its lower half rising from a rough stone foundation streaked with the green and white mineral staining of many decades of freeze and thaw. The siding had weathered to the color of driftwood. The roof had moss on it, and the ridge was not quite true, the whole structure leaning a few degrees to the left, the way an old man leans into a wind that has been blowing at him for years. A narrow dock ran out from the right side of the building and ended at a single piling that leaned the other direction, the 2 angles almost canceling each other out, as if the building and the dock had agreed on a compromise. Margaret sat behind the wheel and looked at it. She had never been here. She had known this property existed the way you know that a relative you have never met exists as a fact that is true, but has no texture to it. Arthur had never brought her here. had never offered to bring her here, had owned this building for 35 years, and had never once said to his daughter, "Come up and see it." She got out of the car. The air was colder than she had been expecting, with an edge in it that was different from Ohio cold weather and older, carrying the smell of pine resin and wood smoke from somewhere far off, and something else underneath both of those, something mineral and clean, that she would later come to know as the smell of lake water still moving under the last of the ice. She walked the 20 yards down the gravel path to the boathouse. Up close, it was bigger than it had appeared from the car. Solid in the foundation. Whatever was wrong with the roof and the trim, the bones of the thing were right. There were two doors. The wide swinging door on the front face of the building, the one that would have opened to let a boat slide in and out onto the water, was bolted shut from the inside. The smaller door on the side facing the gravel path had a hasp and a padlock. She stopped. The padlock was brass, clean brass. The keyway was bright and without corrosion. She crouched down and looked at it more closely. No pitting, no rust blooms in the seams, no salt deposit in the shackle channel. This lock had been installed recently, within the last 2 years at most, probably less. Arthur had been dead for 3 years. She stood up and held the brass key from the manila folder against the keyway. The fit was wrong by a wide margin. The key from the folder was an old mortise key, heavy with a square shank and a simple angled bit. The padlock in front of her was a modern laminated lock of the kind sold at any hardware store. These two objects were from different eras and had nothing to do with each other. Her father had been dead for 3 years. The lock had been here for less than that. Someone had been coming here after Arthur was gone. Someone had maintained this place, or at least secured it, after there was no longer an owner to do so. She was the owner now legally, according to the deed in the folder in the car. But someone else had apparently known that and had acted on it without her. She walked around the building. The lake-facing side had 2 windows, both boarded over with plywood that had been cut to fit and screwed in with sheet metal screws, the screw heads showing rust at the edges, but the wood itself in fair condition. The back of the building, tucked into the tree line, had a smaller door, older than the side door. No hasp, no padlock, just a wooden bar resting in 2 iron brackets. Margaret lifted the bar. The door scraped open on a warped bottom edge. Inside was dark and smelled of cold water and old wood, and something underneath both of those, a faint metallic smell she recognized after a moment as the smell of tools that had been properly oiled and left. She turned on the flashlight she kept in the glove compartment. The lower bay was long and narrow, maybe 40 feet from the back wall to the wide front door, with a U-shaped wooden walkway around an open slip in the center floor where a boat could tie up. The slip was dry, the lake blocked off at the front by a heavy plank gate set in a track. On the far wall, 2 cedar canoes hung upside down from the rafters on rope cradles. Both of them painted white. The paint cracked along the grain in the way cedar checks when it has been through enough seasons. Along the inside wall, a workbench ran the full length of the building. She walked to it and held the flashlight above it and looked at what was there. Every tool was laid out in a specific place, each one sitting inside a chalk outline on the bench surface, a silhouette of exactly that tool in exactly that position, so that anyone who moved it would know where it went, and anyone who looked at the bench could see at a glance if something was missing. The tools had a thin film of oil on them, not old oil that had dried to a gum, but recent oil applied in the last few months. Someone was maintaining this place, not preserving it, not mothballing it, maintaining it the way you maintain tools you intend to keep using. She stood at that bench in the cold dark of her father's boathouse and looked at the row of oiled tools in their chalk outlines and felt something shift in her chest that she did not have a name for yet. At the far end of the bay, a narrow staircase ran up the side wall to a closed door. Margaret crossed to it and put her hand on the rail. The wood was smooth from use, the finish worn off at the place where a hand naturally falls. She climbed. The door at the top was locked, not with a padlock, but with a deadbolt set into the door itself, heavy, a good brand, the kind built to last. She tried the brass key from the manila folder. It went in and did not turn. She tried it the other direction. It did not turn. She tried every other key on her ring. None of them worked. She stood at the top of the stairs with her forehead almost touching the door. On the other side of this door was something. She could not have told you how she knew that, but she had spent enough time in rooms to understand what a locked door meant. A locked door meant something worth keeping. She went back down. She went out the back door and crossed the gravel and got in the car. She started the engine and put the heat on full and sat with her hands in front of the vent while the cab warmed, and then she put her seat back as far as it would go, and she looked at the ceiling of the car and listened to the engine and the sound of the lake moving in the dark. She thought about Arthur standing at the end of the driveway in Maine without waving. The last time she had seen him from the rearview mirror, the man with his hands in his pockets watching the car go. She thought about what it meant that her father had put this property in her name alone 35 years ago, the year after she married Robert. Not before. After. She thought about all of it until her body, which had been driving for 2 days on 4 hours of sleep and too much bad coffee and not enough food, made the decision for her. She slept. She woke at 4 in the morning with a stiff neck and both hands cold. The engine had run itself out of gas sometime in the night, and the heat had gone with it. The cab was the temperature of the outside air. She could see her breath. Through the windshield, the lake was a darker shape against a slightly less dark sky, and the boathouse was a shadow leaning into the tree line. She sat up and worked her neck slowly and listened to what it said about sleeping in a car at 62. She had a half-inch of cold coffee in the thermos. She drank it. She got out of the car and walked to the water's edge and stood there in the dark with the cold coming off the lake and the pre-dawn silence pressing in from all sides. Somewhere out on the water, ice groaned, a long, low sound that traveled across the surface and faded before it reached the shore. She drove up the gravel spur and out onto the county road in the direction of town. Harwick was 6 miles from the boathouse on a road that ran along the edge of the lake for 2 of those miles before cutting inland through second-growth spruce. She passed a closed feed store with a hand-painted sign faded to illegibility. A church with a plywood panel where a window had been. A gas station that was dark. Then a diner with a yellow neon sign in the window that said "Open" in letters that had probably been burning since before Margaret was born, and a light on inside and a woman moving behind the counter. She parked in the gravel lot and went in. The warmth of the place hit her before the door was fully open. Not the manufactured warmth of a chain restaurant with a climate control system, but the real warmth of a space heated by cooking and by people and by a place that has been warm for a long time and intends to stay that way. She stood in the doorway for a moment and let it settle into her. The woman behind the counter was in her late 50s, tall and broad through the shoulders, wearing a flannel shirt the color of old pine under a clean white apron. Her hair was gray and cut short, not stylishly short, but practically short, the haircut of a woman who has decided she has more important things to do in the morning than spend time on her hair. She was wiping down the counter in the efficient circular motion of someone who has wiped down this counter 10,000 times and will wipe it down 10,000 more. She looked up when the bell above the door rang. "Morning," she said. "Morning," Margaret said. She sat at the counter. She set a coffee mug in front of her before she asked for it and filled it from the pot she had in her hand. The coffee was dark and thick and almost too hot to drink, and Margaret wrapped both hands around the mug and held it. "Something to eat, whatever's quickest." "2 eggs and toast." She said it the way a person states a fact rather than asks a question. "That's fine." She moved to the flat top behind her. Margaret heard butter hit the grill. She drank the coffee and looked at the small frame photographs on the wall behind the counter. Local scenes mostly. The lake in summer. A logging truck on a road she recognized as the county road. A group of people in rain gear on a dock. The woman set the plate in front of her and refilled the coffee without asking. She went back to the other end of the counter and resumed her wiping. Margaret ate slowly. The eggs were done the right way, firm at the edges and not quite set in the center, and the toast had real butter on it, and the butter had melted all the way through. When she pushed the empty plate away, the woman came back to refill the coffee again, and Margaret said, "Is there a general store in town that opens early?" She looked at her for a moment with the particular look of a person in a small town who has identified that you are not from here and is deciding how much of that to say. Doyle's, she said, on the main road half-mile up. Ruth opens at 6. Margaret paid and left a tip larger than she could justify at the moment and went back out to the cold. Doyle's General Store in Lake Supply was a long wooden building with a covered porch across the front and a hand-painted sign in faded red above the door. The porch had been swept clean of snow recently. A cord of firewood was stacked along the near end with a blue tarp over it weighted down with a row of river rocks. The lights were on inside. The bell above the door rang when she pushed it open. Inside the store was warm and smelled of coffee and cedar shavings and the particular mixture of motor oil and hemp rope that general stores in Lake Country have smelled of since before anyone now living could remember. The shelves held the practical inventory of a community that was far enough from a city to stock what people actually needed. Bag salt, propane fittings, work gloves in 3 weights, marine epoxy, canned goods organized by type, a section of fishing tackle that was current and complete. A wood stove glowed in the far corner with 2 ladder-back chairs pulled up to it. Behind the counter stood a woman who she took to be about her own age, 60 or thereabouts, tall and broad-shouldered with short silver hair and a green flannel shirt over a white thermal undershirt. She was filling a coffee cup from a percolator on the counter, and she looked up when the bell rang. "Help you find something," she said. "I'm looking for Ruth Hartley." She set the percolator down. "You found her." Margaret walked to the counter. Her hands had started to shake, which was something her hands did not do. She put them flat on the counter. "My name is Margaret Holcomb," she said. "Arthur's daughter." For a moment, the only sound in the store was the small, dry tick of the wood stove working through a new piece of wood. Ruth Hartley looked at her. She looked at her face and then at her hands flat on the counter and then at her face again. She set down her coffee cup with the care of someone setting down something that might tip. She came around the end of the counter. She stopped about 3 feet away and looked at her again. At her face, at her hands. At her face. "You have his hands," she said quietly. "Exactly." Margaret did not answer. She was looking at a point past Ruth's shoulder. Ruth went to the front door of the store and turned the lock and flipped the cardboard sign in the window from open to closed. She did not explain or apologize for this. She said, "Come in the back. I'm going to make us some breakfast." The back of the store was a small kitchen with a square wooden table and 4 chairs and a window that looked out on the alley behind the building where the morning was coming in gray and slow. Ruth put a cast iron pan on the gas burner and set it heating and cracked 4 eggs into a bowl and beat them with a fork with 3 quick strokes. She did not ask any questions while she cooked. She did not make the kind of conversation that fills silence with noise. She cooked the eggs and put them on 2 plates and put the plates on the table and sat down across from Margaret and ate 2 bites and then set her fork down. "Your father called me on a Thursday evening," she said, "about 4.5 years ago. He asked me if I would be willing to look after the Boathouse property after he was gone. He said he needed someone in town he could trust to check on it once a month, handle anything that needed handling locally, and make sure a young man named Jake Mercer had access to the upper workshop to continue a project that was underway." Margaret held her coffee cup. "The next morning he came into the store and he told me he had pancreatic cancer. He had known for 6 weeks. He had not told you. He was very clear that he did not want you to know until it was over. He said that if you came up while he was sick, you would try to stay and take care of him, and that he could not have that. He said it would make things worse for both of you in ways that he didn't have the words to explain." Margaret put her coffee cup down on the table. "He was sick for 11 months, Ruth said. Jake and I took turns going out to the property. Jake had been working with your father for 5 years by then, apprenticing in the upper workshop on weekends and evenings. When Arthur couldn't work anymore, Jake took over on his own. He's been out there most weekends for the last 3 years." "Who put the new lock on the side door?" Margaret asked. "Jake. About 18 months ago. The old one rusted through. He didn't want anybody getting in who shouldn't." "And the door upstairs," Ruth looked at her steadily. "That's where we're going," she said. "But there's something else I need to tell you first, and I want you to hear it before you go up there." Margaret waited. "Your father talked about you," Ruth said. Not in the way that people talk about someone they're angry with or someone they've given up on. He talked about you the way a person talks about something they were very proud of and were not sure they had ever said so while they had the chance. He talked about the years you spent teaching, about the way you thought about problems, about the fact that you had taken what he taught you with your hands and applied it to everything else in your life. He talked about Claire the way grandparents talk about grandchildren they don't see enough of and know it. Margaret looked at the table. He was not a man who said things easily. Ruth said, "You know that better than I do." But he was not quiet because he didn't feel things. He was quiet because he felt things too much and didn't have the machinery for it. There's a difference. I spent 4 years watching him work on what's in that upper room, and I want you to understand that before you see it. Margaret nodded once. Ruth put the key ring in her coat pocket and put on the coat and a wool watch cap and a pair of heavy gloves, and she said, "Let's go." They drove out in her truck the same county road, the same 6 miles of spruce and birch in the gray morning light. She did not turn on the radio. She drove with both hands on the wheel and watched the road the way people drive, who have driven a road so many times that the driving itself requires no attention, and the attention can be given to other things. "He had me check the property once a month," she said, watching the road. "Jake goes out most weekends. He finished the major work on the upper project about 14 months ago. Since then, he's been on the detail work. Varnish coats, hardware, getting the engine ready. He's a serious young man. He doesn't talk much, but when he does, it means something." The trees opened and the lake came up gray and wide in the morning light, and the boathouse was there at the end of the spur, leaning the dock, leaning the other way, the whole arrangement looking as improbable and as permanent as it had looked the night before. Ruth pulled up beside her car and got out and went straight to the side door with the brass padlock. She had the key for it in her hand before she reached it. The lock came off cleanly. She pulled the door open and stepped back. "Up the stairs," she said. "You first." Margaret went up, the door at the top. Ruth came up behind her and stepped past her and put a key into the deadbolt and turned it with a soft, well-oiled click and pushed the door open with her shoulder and stepped back again. "You first," she said, and her voice had changed slightly. Not softer, more careful. The way a person's voice changes when they are about to show you something that matters. Margaret walked through the door. The loft was 20 feet wide and ran the full length of the building 40 feet from the back wall to the south face, and the south face was almost entirely glass. 4 large windows, each one divided into 6 panes running floor to near ceiling, and through them the lake lay out in the morning light in a long gray plain broken only by the dark line of the far shore. The light came in across the floor in long slanted bars, catching the dust in the air and laying gold stripes across the pine boards. A wood stove sat in the northeast corner cold now, with a stack of split cordwood beside it, and a coal scuttle and a box of matches on the small shelf above it. The walls on the other 3 sides were lined with workbenches and tool racks and shelving, chisels and oiled wooden holders sorted by width, coils of bronze rigging wire on wooden pegs, a long row of bar clamps sorted by length, sandpaper in a wooden tray organized by grit, the labels on each slot written in the same careful block letters as the filing cabinet in the basement on Birchwood Lane. The floor was swept clean, and the air smelled of linseed oil and cedar, and the faint resinous sweetness of fresh varnish. And in the center of the room, on 2 padded sawhorses under a canvas drop cloth that had been laid over it with the precision of someone who wanted it to look like nothing significant, was a shape. The shape was about 22 feet long. The bow was high and curving, and the stern was rounded, and the whole thing sat up on the sawhorses at chest height with the drop cloth draped over it in long, clean folds that told you even before you reached for it that whatever was underneath was something that had been cared for. Margaret stood in front of it. She heard Ruth come up behind her and stop. She took the corner of the canvas in both hands. She pulled it back. The wood underneath was mahogany, not the flat mahogany of furniture or trim work, but something deeper than that, a red-brown that seemed to come from inside the grain rather than from the surface, the color that wood achieves when it has been worked and oiled and worked again over many years by hands that knew what they were doing. The hull curved away from her in lines that were not straight, but were precise in the way that the best curves are precise, each one following a logic that the eye accepts before the mind has worked out why. The deck was inlaid with strips of holly between the mahogany planks, pale cream-colored lines running fore to aft like the lines on a nautical chart, each one perfectly consistent in width from bow to stern. The brass hardware on the side decks was fitted and polished. The cockpit was clean and lined with teak grating that had been oiled until it glowed. She walked to the stern. The transom was a single piece of mahogany, broad and gently curved, and into the face of it 2 words had been cut by hand, not routed, not stenciled. Cut with a chisel by hand, each letter worked slowly and carefully, and then smoothed and oiled so that the cuts had darkened with time and become part of the wood rather than marks on it. For Margaret, she put her hand on the transom. The wood was warm even in the cold loft. She stood with her palm against the grain and felt the warmth of it, and looked at her own name cut into it in her father's careful hand, and did not move for a long time. Behind her, Ruth said quietly, "He started the year you married Robert. He worked on her every weekend. He wasn't taking a customer's boat. 15 years of weekends, more or less, until the cancer made it impossible. Jake has been carrying her the last 3 years." Margaret did not answer. She walked the length of the boat with her hand on the rail. She came back to the transom and looked at her name again, and then she lowered herself onto the sawhorse with the folded canvas across her lap, and she put her face in her hands. She did not make any sound. She sat on the sawhorse in the loft of her father's boathouse, with her face in her hands, and the morning light came in through the south windows and lay across the floor in gold bars, and the dust moved in it very slowly. Ruth said nothing. She pulled up the second sawhorse and sat down across from her and waited with the patience of someone who has learned that waiting is sometimes the only useful thing a person can offer. After a while, without looking up, Margaret said, "How long did he think it would take?" She was quiet for a moment. "He told Jake it would be done when it was done. He said the same thing to me once about you, that some things take as long as they take and you don't rush them." Margaret lifted her head. Her face was steady. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set and her hands were still. She looked at the boat on the sawhorses in the morning light. "What's left to do?" she said. And then the stairs creaked. A sound on the steps below, not heavy, not cautious, the steady climbing sound of something that knew these stairs well and was not in a hurry. A dog appeared in the doorway. A Labrador chocolate brown, big through the chest and white at the muzzle, with the careful, deliberate movement of a dog that was old enough to know it didn't need to hurry anymore, but young enough in its heart to want to. Its eyes were the deep amber that old labs sometimes have, the color that comes from years of paying close attention. The dog stopped in the doorway. It lifted its nose. It looked at Margaret, and then it looked at the gray flannel shirt that was hanging on a peg near the wood stove, and then it looked back at Margaret. Its ears came up. It crossed the loft in 5 long, even strides and walked directly to her and pressed its head into the side of her knee with the full weight of a large dog's skull and held it there. Margaret put her hand on the dog's ear. The dog sighed and sat down on her foot. The man came up the stairs more slowly. He appeared in the doorway and stopped, and Margaret looked at him. He was in his late 20s, lean and long through the arms, wearing a canvas work coat, the color of dead leaves, and steel-toed boots that had seen real work. His dark hair was under a wool watch cap that had been washed so many times it had lost its original shape. His hands were stained with varnish thinner. He had the face of a young man who had spent a lot of time outdoors doing work that required concentration, and had developed around his eyes the particular stillness of someone who looks at things closely before he speaks about them. He looked at Margaret. He looked at the dog sitting on her foot. Something in his face shifted in a way that did not need to be explained. "He's got a good nose," the man said. Margaret looked down at the dog. "Skipper." The man came across the loft and held out his hand. "Jake Mercer." His handshake was careful and exact, the handshake of someone who knows the difference between a firm grip and a painful one. "I'm sorry I wasn't here when you arrived," Jake said. "Ruth couldn't reach me. I'd have been here." It's all right. Jake looked at the boat and then back at Margaret. He sat down on the third sawhorse, the one near the workbench, and put his forearms on his thighs. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the boat. He talked about you all the time, Jake said. Not about the situation. About you when you were small. About teaching you to read a level when you were 8 because you kept following him around the shop. About the summer you caught your first legal base off this dock and let it go because you said it looked like it still had work to do. He smiled a little when he said that one. Margaret looked at the lake through the south windows. He never told me about this place, she said. No. He never told me he was sick. No. A long silence in which Skipper did not move from her foot. He thought you would come and try to take care of him, Jake said. And he thought that would be wrong. He said he'd spent his whole life trying to give you things that would stand up without him there. He didn't want the last thing to be something you had to hold up for him. Margaret put her hand on the dog's back. Tell me what's left to do on the boat. Jake stood. He walked her around the hull, crouching at the waterline to show her where the garboard strakes met the keel, standing on the sawhorse to point out the deckwork above. 2 more coats of varnish on the foredeck, he said. Each coat needed a full day to cure between applications. The brass cleats needed to be set into the fore, and after decks 8 in total. Each one bedded in marine sealant and countersunk true. The windshield frame was fitted and ready, but the glass had not been installed. The helm wheel was in a crate under the workbench ready to be bolted on. The engine was a rebuilt 6-cylinder marine inboard from a 1950s Chris Craft that Arthur had spent his last winter of working capacity restoring, and it was wrapped in plastic sheeting in the corner near the stairs. A marine mechanic Jake knew from the next town over would need a full day to lower it into the engine well and connect it properly. How long for all of it? Margaret asked. 2 weeks if you work with me, 3 if you don't. I'll work with you. Jake looked at her. Have you worked with wood before my father tried to teach me? I was 17 and not interested. Are you interested now? Yes. Jake nodded once and reached up to a shelf above the workbench and brought down a small wooden toolbox. He set it on the bench and opened it. Inside were 6 chisels, each one with a brass-tipped wooden handle worn smooth from years of use, each one in a leather sleeve with the blade protected. The handles were old hardwood, somewhere between walnut and cherry in color, the grain running straight through each one. 5 of the sleeves were blank. The first sleeve, the one that held the narrowest chisel, had a letter burned into the leather. The letter was M. Margaret reached into the box and took out the chisel with the M on its sleeve and held it in her hand. She did not take it out of the sleeve. She just held the weight of it. He left that one for you, Jake said quietly. He told me before he died that if somebody came who was his blood and wanted to learn, those were for that person. Otherwise, he said to bury them with him. Margaret closed her hand around the chisel. She opened it and looked at the M on the leather. She set it back in the box carefully. All right, she said. Her voice was even but not steady, and she did not pretend otherwise. That afternoon, after Ruth had gone back to the store and Jake had walked her through the loft and shown her where everything was kept and how the wood stove worked and where the water line came into the building. From the well, Margaret drove into town and knocked on the door of a small green clapboard house on a side street off the main road where a man Ruth had called was waiting with a key. The house was 1 bedroom, a kitchen with a gas range and a window above the sink that looked at the back wall of the hardware store. A living room with a brick fireplace and floors that tilted 2 degrees toward the north wall, and a couch that had been there since before the current tenant of the house before this one. A back porch off the kitchen looking at a stand of birches, still bare this early in March. The rent was $400 a month. Margaret signed a 6-month lease and wrote a check from the account she had opened that morning at the bank in town on the advice of James Aldridge, whose office was on the 2nd floor of the building above the hardware store, accessible by a staircase that creaked in the middle. The check was the first she had written from an account that had only her name on it since she was 26 years old. She drove back to the boathouse and got her duffel bags from the car and brought them into the green clapboard house and set them on the bedroom floor. She put her toiletry bag in the bathroom. She set the coffee pot on the counter and plugged it in. She put her father's flannel shirt on the peg by the back door. She stood in the middle of the living room with the tilted floor and the old couch and the fireplace that would need cleaning before she used it, and she turned in a slow circle. She had not lived alone since she was 26 years old. The thought arrived without sentimentality, just as a fact, a data point in the accounting of her situation. She noted it and let it go. The next morning, she was at the boathouse before Jake. She built the fire in the wood stove with the wood from the stack beside it, the way she had watched Arthur split kindling when she was a child, and she had the stove going and the loft warming, and the coffee she had brought in her thermos poured into the 2 mugs she had found on the shelf above the workbench by the time she heard the truck on the gravel below. Jake came up the stairs and stopped in the doorway and looked at the stove going and the coffee on the bench. He did not say anything. He took the mug, and that was all. They worked the boat. Jake showed her how to sand with the grain of the mahogany, how to keep the pressure even across the full face of the sanding block so that you were cutting the surface and not rounding it. He showed her how to feel the surface with the pad of her thumb and distinguish between ready and not ready, the way a craftsman distinguishes between them not by measurement, but by touch. He showed her how to cut a bronze wood screw to length with a hacksaw clamped in the vise, and how to dress the cut end so that it would still take a driver without stripping. Margaret was not good at it the first day. She was not good at it the second day. Her hands knew how to do things. She had been working with her hands her whole life in different ways, but they knew how to do the large things, the administrative things, the things that happened at the scale of pages and numbers and human beings. This was different. This was working at the scale of a thumbnail, a chisel blade, a screw head. Her hands did not yet know this language. She did not say so. She watched and she tried again. By the 4th day, her thumb had developed a fine coating of varnish dust that would not wash off. By the 6th day, she could look at the surface of the foredeck and tell without touching it where it needed another pass of the block and where it was done. Skipper slept on a folded blanket by the wood stove and watched them work. In the afternoons, Margaret drove into town. She had coffee with Ruth at the general store on 3 separate occasions, each one lasting longer than she had intended. Ruth did not push. She asked the kind of questions that had answers without requiring a person to expose herself. Questions about the work, and about Claire, and about the years of teaching. Margaret found herself telling Ruth things in that back kitchen over coffee that she had not said aloud to anyone, not because they were private, but because she had not previously had anyone who would receive them without either dismissing them or making too much of them. Ruth told her about Harwick, about the family she had known for 30 years, about the way the town had changed and the ways it had stayed exactly the same. About Arthur's clients, the old Boston families, and the retired professionals who had brought their classic wooden boats to him for restoration over 2 decades, some of them driving 6 hours each way to have someone they trusted work on something they valued. She told her that Arthur had been known from Bar Harbor to Portsmouth as the finest wooden boat restorer on the Maine coast, and that he had never advertised, and that his waiting list had been 3 years long at its peak. Margaret had known her father was a craftsman. She had not known the scale of it. On the 6th morning, Aldridge called her at the green-clapboard house. James Aldridge's office above the hardware store held the particular atmosphere of a space that had been organized once long ago by someone who knew what they were doing and had been maintained in that organization ever since. The shelves were full of files in an order that Aldridge alone could reconstruct from first principles. The furniture was old and solid and not especially comfortable, and was clearly not intended to be. The window looked down on the main road of Harwick, where on this morning a man was unloading bags of road salt from a pickup. Aldridge was 68 in a brown corduroy jacket that was his color, in the way that certain colors become a person's color after they have worn them long enough. He had reading glasses on a chain around his neck and a file on the desk in front of him that he had clearly reviewed before Margaret arrived. He stood when she came in and shook her hand with both of his own. "I've been keeping this file for quite some time, Miss Holcomb," he said. "I want you to know that. I want you to understand that nothing in it surprised your father. He put everything in order that he meant to put in order, and he left it with me with specific instructions about when it was to be opened. The instruction was when his daughter comes in to claim the trust. That is now. He opened the file and turned it so she could read it. The trust was called the Arthur Holcomb Spendthrift Trust. Margaret's name appeared at the top of the beneficiary page as the sole name beneficiary. The trust document was dated 34 years ago, the year after Margaret and Robert had married. The establishment amount was modest. The contribution history ran down the following page in a column quarterly entries going back 3 decades, each one a date and an amount. The amounts ranged from a few $1,000s in the early years to 30 and 40,000 in the years when the business had been strongest. Margaret read the column of numbers to the bottom. She looked at the total. She looked at it again. The corpus of the trust after taxes and administrative fees sat in a money market account at a bank in Bangor and held $338,000 in change. She set the paper down. "What is a spendthrift trust?" she said. Aldridge leaned forward slightly. "It means," he said, "that this money cannot be reached by a creditor. It cannot be seized by a court order. It cannot be touched by a spouse regardless of any power of attorney that spouse may hold. It is distributed to you on a schedule and in amounts you control through a mechanism that is outside the reach of any third party. Your father structured it this way on purpose. He was very explicit about it when we first sat in this office. He said that he wanted to build his daughter a floor that nobody could pull out from under her." Margaret looked at the window. "Did he tell you why?" she said. Aldridge considered her for a moment. "He told me the only time I asked him directly that he had concerns about the financial arrangements in his daughter's household that went back a long way, and that he was not confident his daughter would ever see them clearly enough to protect herself. Those were his words, concerns that went back a long way." Margaret was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the man with the road salt had finished stacking and driven away, and the sidewalk below was empty in the March morning. "Is there anything else in the file?" she said. Aldridge turned to the next page. There was an envelope, business-sized white sealed, her name on the front in Arthur's handwriting. The envelope had the look of something that had been handled carefully and stored correctly and had waited without being opened for exactly as long as it needed to wait. "This was in the file when your father gave it to me," Aldridge said. "He said it was not to be opened until you came in to claim the trust. He was very specific about that sequence. I don't know what it says. I've never opened it." He slid the envelope across the desk. Margaret looked at it. She picked it up and held it for a moment, and then put it in the inside pocket of her coat against her chest. She thanked Aldridge and shook his hand and went down the creaking stairs and out onto the main road of Harwick and stood in the cold for a moment with her hands in her pockets. She called Claire from the car. Claire answered quickly, the way she had been answering since Margaret had started calling regularly. Margaret told her about the trust. She told her the number. She heard her daughter go quiet on the other end of the line, in the particular way that Claire went quiet when she was working through something too large to speak to immediately. "Mom," Claire said finally, "did he know? Did Grandpa know?" "He knew," Margaret said. "About Dad?" "He knew something. He had known something for 30 years. Another silence. Then Claire said, "Are you all right?" "I don't know yet," Margaret said. "I think I'm going to be." She drove back to the boathouse. Jake was in the loft, bedding a brass cleat into the foredeck, working the marine sealant under the flange with a narrow palette knife, wiping the excess with a clean rag. Skipper got up from his blanket and came to Margaret and pressed his head against her knee. Margaret sat down on the sawhorse. "I need to read something out loud," she said. She had not planned to say it. She did not know why she said it then. "Would you stay?" Jake set the palette knife down on the bench. He sat down on the other sawhorse. "Yes," he said. Margaret took the envelope from the inside pocket of her coat. She opened it with the smallest chisel from the wooden box, running the blade carefully along the sealed edge so that the paper did not tear. Inside were 3 sheets of yellow legal paper, folded once covered on both sides in Arthur's small, disciplined hand. She unfolded them and looked at the first line for a moment. Then she read, "Margaret, I don't know what year you are reading this. I hope it is many years from now. I hope you have come into James's office out of curiosity to see what I left because your life is full and you have time to be curious. But the trust says you've come in because you needed to. And so I'm going to write this on the assumption that something has gone wrong, and I'm going to tell you the truth about several things I never told you while I was alive. I never trusted Robert. I want to be honest with you about when I knew and how I knew. The second time he asked me for money during your engagement without mentioning that I hadn't seen the first amount returned, I understood what kind of man he was. Not a bad man in every way, but a man who managed money the way certain people manage money, which is to say, by managing other people's access to it. I tried to tell you once, you were 26. You looked at me the way a person looks at someone who has just told them the thing they most do not want to hear. I saw that I was going to lose you if I pushed it, and I decided I would rather have you with that man than not have you at all. That was my choice, and I made it, and I lived with it. So I made another choice alongside it. I bought the boathouse the year after you married him and put it in your name alone because I wanted there to be something you owned that he had no claim to. I started setting aside money from the restoration work the same year. I put it in a trust structured so that he could not touch it and so that you could not hand it to him because I knew that if it were accessible to you, it would eventually become accessible to him. I worked on the boat every weekend I was well enough to work because it was the thing I most wanted to give you and because the work itself was how I thought. It was how I worked things out. You were always in the room when I was working on her. That probably doesn't make sense. I'm sorry. It made sense to me. I stopped calling as much as I should have. I want you to understand why. Every time you brought Robert with you or mentioned him in a way that told me things were how I thought they were, I could not keep what was in my face out of my face. And that hurt you. You would close in the way you closed in when you were a child and someone said something about your mother, that particular drawing inward. I could not do that to you, and I could not stop myself from doing it, so I chose distance. It was wrong. It was the wrong choice. It was the choice I made. I am sorry I was not a better father in the years after your mother died. I did not know how to be a father to an adult daughter when I was also learning to be a man without Eleanor. I turned to the work because the work was reliable and I was not. I should have turned to you instead. You were the one who needed it. I knew that, and I was not able to do it, and I'm sorry. There is enough in the trust to take care of you well for a long time if you are sensible, which you are. The boathouse is yours, and you may do with it what you wish. The boat I built is yours, and Jake can finish her with you if you will let him. He is a good young man. He loved me better than I made it possible for you to love me. And that is my fault, and not his, and not yours. Be well, Margaret. I loved you. I am sorry the only way I could find to show it was in wood. Your father. She lowered the pages to her lap. The lamplight made a small yellow circle on the workbench behind Jake. Outside the south windows, the lake was dark and still. Somewhere far across it, a loon called once and was answered by nothing. Jake had not moved. His face was wet. I didn't know about the letter, Jake said. I know you didn't. Margaret folded the pages and slid them back into the envelope and put the envelope in the inside pocket of her coat. She sat for a moment with her hand flat over the outside of the coat pocket over the place where the envelope was. Then she stood up. I need some air, she said. She went down the stairs and out the back door and along the gravel path and out to the end of the dock. The planks were solid under her boots. The lake moved in small dark shifts against the pilings. The cold came off the water and through her coat, and she stood in it and let it come. The sky above the far shore held a handful of pale stars. The spruce line was a black silhouette. There was no moon yet. Jake came out and stood beside her after a minute. He did not speak. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the lake with her the way people stand beside each other when standing beside each other is what is called for. After a long time, Margaret said, he didn't trust me to find my own way out. Jake thought about that. Then he said, I don't think that's it. I think he didn't trust himself to be there when you needed to find it. He paused. So he put the things there instead. Margaret looked at the water. He built me a floor, she said, in case everything else went out from under me. Jake nodded. She stood at the end of her father's dock in the dark with the cold coming off Stillwater Lake and the last of the night moving slowly toward whatever came next. She stood there until the stars above the far shore went three and then two and then one and then none as the cloud cover moved in from the northwest. She stood there until the cold had worked all the way through her and become simply the temperature of things. Then she went back inside. Sheriff Heck Braddock came down the gravel path on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of March, with his hat in his hand in his county truck parked up by the road. Margaret heard the tires on the spur and came to the doorway of the upper loft and watched him come down toward the boathouse, and she could tell from the way the man walked, measured and deliberate and without hurry, that whatever he was carrying was not nothing. Braddock was a few years older than Margaret, thick through the chest, in the way that men who have done physical work their whole lives remain thick even when the work slows, with a face that had been outdoors in Maine, weather for 6 decades, and showed it honestly. He had known Arthur. He had told her so the first time they met briefly at the hardware store, in the way that people in small towns mention the dead when they encounter the living who belong to them. Not to cause pain, but because the connection is real, and to ignore it would be a kind of dishonesty. He stopped at the foot of the dock and looked up at her in the loft doorway. "You got a minute, Maggie?" She came down. They walked to the end of the dock, and Braddock stood with his back to the water, the way he had apparently decided to do this, looking at the boathouse rather than the lake, and Margaret stood beside him. "There's a man at the FBI field office in Tampa who has been trying to reach you for 2 days," Braddock said. "He called my office this morning because he couldn't get through on your cell. I told him I would deliver the message in person. His name is Dale Whitfield." Margaret looked at the boathouse. "I drove out here instead of calling you," Braddock said, "because this is the only place in your life right now where the rest of it isn't following you through the door. I wanted to bring it carefully." Margaret nodded. Braddock took a card from his shirt pocket and held it out. She took it. "Dale Whitfield, Special Agent, FBI, Tampa Field Office. Your husband," Braddock said, and he stopped. And then he said, "Your husband was not running from your marriage, Maggie. He was running from something else that was already closing in on him from another direction. From what Whitfield told me, he didn't know which direction was going to get there first." She turned the card over in her hand. The back was blank. "Tell me what you know," Braddock told her. He told her briefly and without editorializing. Robert and a man named Clifton Malone had been running a contracting fraud operation for the better part of 8 years. Permits filed under the name of a construction company Robert had registered without her knowledge. Inspections signed off under credentials that were not theirs to use. Money moved through accounts in a pattern that the IRS had flagged 18 months ago and referred to the Bureau. Robert's name was on the documents. Robert was the target. He had been picked up 2 nights ago at a motel outside Nashville. Clifton Malone had been arrested the same morning at a storage facility in Louisville. The Bureau needed Margaret's cooperation to establish what she had and had not known which, from what Whitfield had told Braddock, was apparently going to be straightforward to establish because her name appeared on none of the fraudulent documentation. Margaret stood on the dock and held the card and looked at the lake. What she felt was not what she had expected to feel. She had expected the clean, hot burn of being wronged in a way large enough to justify any response. What she felt instead was something quieter and harder to name. Not relief, not satisfaction. The particular settling of a woman who has been carrying the weight of a situation she could not fully see and has now seen it and understands at last why it was so heavy. "I appreciate you coming out here," she said. Braddock put his hat back on. "You call Whitfield tonight," he said. "And Maggie." He paused. "I'm sorry it took all of this to get you back up here. Your father talked about you. He would have liked knowing you were in that loft." She called Claire from the kitchen of the green-clappered house that evening, with the card on the table in front of her and a glass of water she had poured and not touched. She told her daughter everything Braddock had told her. Claire listened without interrupting, which was not her natural tendency, and which told Margaret how seriously she was taking it. When she finished, Claire said, "I'm coming to Tampa with you. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I'm coming." They agreed on flights. Margaret would go out of Bangor the following morning. Claire would come out of Denver and meet her at the gate in Tampa. She called Dale Whitfield after she hung up with Claire. Whitfield was professional in the way that federal agents are professional when they have done a difficult job for long enough that the difficulty has become simply the texture of the work. He was concise. He outlined what the Bureau needed from her, which was a sworn statement covering her knowledge of her husband's business activities. He explained that her name appeared on none of the fraudulent documentation, which was consistent with someone who had been kept entirely outside the operation. He said he was sorry for her situation. He said it in a way that sounded as if he meant it. "Tomorrow," Margaret said. "My daughter will be with me." "That's fine," Whitfield said. She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table for a while. Then she went to the boathouse and climbed to the loft and built up the fire in the wood stove and sat on the sawhorse in front of it with her hands in her lap and looked at the boat on its sawhorses in the lamplight. The mahogany hull caught the lamp and held the light in its grain, the way only wood that has been worked correctly holds light, as if the light were coming from inside rather than falling on the surface. She looked at her name carved in the transom. She looked at the line of brass cleats along the foredeck that she had set herself, each one bedded true and wiped clean. She sat there for a long time without doing anything. Then she went back to the house and slept. The flight out of Bangor went to Boston and connected to Tampa. She was in the air for most of the morning. She did not read and she did not sleep. She looked out the window at the cloud cover below the plane and thought about Robert. She had been married to him for 35 years. She had known him as a young man when he was still becoming who he would be, and she had watched him become it, and she had told herself many times over those years that who he was becoming was acceptable, and that what she felt in the quiet moments of their marriage was only the ordinary dissatisfaction of ordinary life and not a signal she was meant to read. She tried now to find a moment when she should have looked more carefully and had not. She could find several. She did not punish herself for them. What she found instead was the recognition that some people present one face in the light and maintain another in the dark, and that the people who live with them are not foolish for having believed what they were shown. She had been shown something. She had believed it. The fault was not hers. She had not been foolish. She had been chosen as someone who would not look too closely, and she had obliged, and she was finished obliging. Claire was at the gate when Margaret came up the jet bridge. She was wearing a jacket her mother had not seen before, and she had the look of someone who had not slept on her flight, the tight quality around the eyes that Claire had always had when she was carrying something she had not yet put down. She was 34 years old, and Margaret could see in her the way you can see it in the people you have known from before they were people. The girl she had been at 12 in the Yellowstone photograph, squinting into the sun, one arm around each of her parents. They walked to each other, and Margaret put her hand on the side of Claire's face for a moment, the way she had when Claire was small, and Claire put both arms around her mother and held on. They stood there for a few seconds in the gate area with the other passengers moving around them. In the cab, Claire was quiet for most of the ride. Then she said, "I tried calling him before he was arrested 3 times over the last couple of weeks. He didn't pick up." "I know. I thought he was just avoiding me because of what happened with you, and he didn't know what to say." "He was avoiding things," Margaret said, "just not for the reason you thought." Claire looked out the cab window at the flat Florida landscape. "I should have asked him a hard question," she said. "Just once. About anything. I never did." Margaret looked at the road. "I asked him easy ones my whole life," Claire said. "He gave me easy answers, and I took them because they were easier than the other kind." "Claire," Margaret said it with the weight of someone who needs another person to stop and hear what is being said. "He was your father. You gave him what children give their parents. You cannot take that back, and it was not wrong to give it." Claire didn't answer for a moment. Then she said quietly, "I know. I just keep thinking about all the years this was happening while we were having regular Sunday calls, and I had no idea." The cab pulled up to the hotel. They got out. They had dinner at the hotel restaurant. They ate without much conversation. Claire ordered wine and drank about half of it. They talked about the work at the boathouse, about the boat, about Jake and Ruth, and the town of Harwick, and Margaret watched something shift in her daughter's face as she talked, some loosening around the eyes. "What's the boat like?" Claire said. "Come see it when this is over," Margaret said. Claire looked at her. "Grandpa really built it for you." "He did. From scratch. From the keel up." Claire was quiet for a moment. "How did you not know he had it?" Margaret thought about that. "Because I wasn't looking for it," she said. "Because I didn't know there was something to look for." They went up to their rooms. Margaret lay on the bed in her room with the lights off and the curtains slightly open and the orange glow of Tampa coming in at the edges. She was not angry. She lay in the darkness and took an accounting of what she felt, the way a good mathematics teacher takes an accounting of an equation before deciding whether its answer is right, and what she found in the place where anger might have been was something quieter and more durable. A kind of completion. Not peace, not yet, but the feeling of a thing that has been in process for a long time, arriving at its natural conclusion. She slept. The federal building downtown was gray granite and glass and had the serious, impersonal quality of buildings designed to convey the weight of institutional authority without inspiring any particular feeling. Dale Whitfield met them in the lobby. He was in his mid-40s, thinner than his voice had suggested, with the careful posture of a man who has spent years sitting in rooms where posture matters. He shook Margaret's hand and then Claire's. The statement room was on the fourth floor, carpeted in the standard government gray, with a small table and 4 chairs and a court reporter set up in the corner with her machine and her expression of professional neutrality. 2 other agents were present, both of whom introduced themselves and then did not speak again. Whitfield conducted the interview. He was methodical and fair and did not try to lead her anywhere. He asked questions in the order that served the record rather than in the order that would have served a dramatic narrative, and Margaret answered each one with the precision she applied to anything that required precision. She had been a mathematics teacher. Precision was her native language. 2 hours and 40 minutes. When it was over, Whitfield turned off the recording and leaned back in his chair and said, "Mrs. Holcomb, I want to be clear with you about something. Your name appears on no documentation in this case. None. Everything we have is consistent with someone who had no knowledge of or involvement in the activity. We are not investigating you. Your cooperation today completes the record, and I am grateful for it." He paused. "You answered every question exactly once. You're the clearest witness I've had in 3 years." Margaret thanked him and stood and put on her coat. They rode the elevator down in silence. The elevator opened on the ground floor lobby, and they walked out, and Margaret stopped. Clifton Malone was sitting on a wooden bench along the near wall of the lobby, his wrists in front of him, connected by a short chain to a metal loop on the bench, waiting for a transfer that had not yet happened. He was wearing the clothes he had apparently been arrested in, and he had the look of a man who had slept badly in a place not designed for sleeping and had not yet had the opportunity to be anything other than exactly what he was. He looked up when the elevator opened. His eyes found Margaret. He opened his mouth. Margaret walked across the lobby toward the exit. She did not slow her pace and she did not look back. She pushed through the heavy glass door and went out into the Tampa morning, into the heat and the light. And Claire came out behind her and they stood on the sidewalk. Claire looked at her. Margaret looked at the street. She had expected in the few seconds between the elevator opening and the door closing behind her that walking past Clifton Malone without speaking would feel like a choice, a deliberate suppression of something that wanted out. What it had actually felt like was nothing, not restraint, absence. Whatever had once occupied the place where her feeling about Robert's accomplice might have lived had simply vacated the premises, and there had been nothing to restrain. "You walked right past him," Claire said. Margaret nodded. "You weren't even angry. I was past it by then." Claire looked at the sidewalk. "That's," she said. She stopped. "I don't know if that's the saddest thing I've ever seen or the most impressive." Margaret looked at the street for a moment. "Maybe they're the same thing," she said. They took a cab back to the hotel. They packed their bags. Their flights were in the afternoon. Claire's back to Denver and Margaret's back to Bangor. They ate lunch in the hotel restaurant and split a piece of pie that was too sweet and left half of it. Claire said, "Mom." Margaret looked up from her coffee. "Are you going to write to him at some point?" Margaret thought about it. "Not yet," she said. "Maybe at some point." "Are you ever going to—" "I don't know. It doesn't need to be decided today." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Can I write to him?" "That's your call to make," Margaret said. "He's your father, even after everything." "He was your father before everything," Margaret said. "That's not something you get to choose. You can be angry at him, and he can still be your father. Both of those things are true at the same time." Another silence. Then Claire said, "I keep thinking about the photograph. The one from Yellowstone." "I know. He took it with him." "I know he did. I keep thinking he took it because he still wanted it, even after everything. Even then." Margaret drank her coffee. "Maybe he did," she said. They flew out in the afternoon. Margaret flew back to Bangor and drove the 2 hours north to Harwick in the dark, and let herself into the green clapboard house, and put the kettle on, and stood at the kitchen window while it heated, and looked at the stand of birches in the backyard, the bare branches catching what light there was from the street and holding it in their white bark. 22 days after that afternoon in the Tampa Federal Building, Aldridge called her at the Boathouse. A letter had arrived at his office from a law firm representing Robert Holcomb. Inside the letter was a cashier's check for $92,000 and a brief legal statement declaring the relinquishment of any claim to funds traceable to the joint accounts of Robert and Margaret Holcomb. Margaret stood in the loft with the phone in her hand and looked at the boat. "Deposit it into the trust," she said. "You don't want to think about it first. I've thought about it. It goes in the trust. The trust is the only place money is safe in my life right now, and I'm not going to let it sit anywhere. It isn't safe." A brief silence on Aldridge's end. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And then quietly, "Your father would have said the same thing." Claire called on a Sunday morning from Denver. She was on the back porch of her apartment. Margaret could tell from the sound of the city behind her voice. "Mom, I'm coming up." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I've given my notice." "What do you mean you've given your notice?" "I quit my job yesterday," Claire said. "I'm coming to Maine. I can help with the books for the workshop. I can help get things organized. I want to be there when the boat goes in the water." A silence. Then Margaret said, "Claire, I've been sitting at a desk in Denver for 6 years, and I've been doing fine, and fine isn't the thing I want anymore." Her daughter's voice was steady and certain in a way Margaret had not heard in it recently. "I want to be where you are. I want to see what Grandpa built. I want to understand what happened to all of us, and I can't do that from Denver." Margaret stood at the kitchen window of the green clapboard house and looked at the birches that had by now begun to show the first small leaves. "Come whenever you're ready," she said. Claire drove up from Denver in 4 days, which was faster than Margaret would have attempted, and slower than Claire usually drove when she was going somewhere she wanted to be. She pulled up to the boathouse on a Tuesday afternoon while Margaret and Jake were fitting the windshield frame, and she came up the stairs and stood in the doorway and looked at the loft and at the boat and at the south windows and the lake beyond them, and she did not say anything for a long time. Then she walked across the loft to the boat. She put her hand on the mahogany rail and ran it slowly from the bow to the stern and crouched at the midships point and looked along the waterline, and then came back and stood in front of the transom. She read the words there. She put her forehead against the wood and stayed there. After a minute, she straightened up. She looked at her mother. She looked at Jake. She looked at the box with the 6 chisels on the workbench. "Show me something," she said. "Anything. I want to learn something while I'm here." Jake showed her how to wet sand a varnished surface. He showed her how to read the gloss of the finish with a low raking light to find the spots that needed another pass. He showed her how to hold the sanding block so the pressure was even and the corners did not cut through. Claire was patient in a way Margaret had not seen in her in years, the patience of a person who has decided that learning a thing correctly is worth the time it takes. Claire's hands, Margaret noticed, were the same shape as Arthur's hands, the same width through the palm, the same length in the fingers, the same way of holding a tool close to the work rather than at arm's length. It was the kind of thing you did not notice until you noticed it and then could not stop noticing. In the evenings, the three of them ate at the green clapboard house or at Ruth's kitchen table above the store. Ruth cooked the way Arthur apparently had cooked, without fanfare and with total competence, as if the preparation of food were a form of serious work and should be treated accordingly. Claire and Ruth talked easily, more easily than Margaret would have predicted. And she sat at the table and watched her daughter talking with this woman who had been the last consistent presence in Arthur's life, and thought about the various forms that family took when you were not watching for them. Robert was sentenced on a Thursday in April. 4 years in a federal correctional facility, eligible for early release after 26 months. Clifton Malone received 6 years on the more serious counts. Margaret learned this from Aldridge, who had been monitoring the case through his Tampa contacts. She was at the Boathouse when Aldridge called with the sentencing. She was on her knees on the loft floor, working a section of deck planking with the smallest chisel, the one with the M on its leather sleeve. She thanked Aldridge and ended the call and set the phone on the bench beside her and went back to the chisel work. Jake looked at her from across the loft but said nothing. Skipper lifted his head from the blanket and then put it back down. That was all. The boat was finished on a Saturday morning in the third week of April when Jake set the helm wheel into place and tightened the 4 brass bolts that held it and sat back on his heels and said, "That's the last of it." The wheel was mahogany with a brass hub and holly inlay in the spokes that matched the holly strip work on the deck. And when Margaret put both hands on it and looked out through the windshield at the south windows and the lake beyond them, it felt correct in the way that very few things feel correct, not as an approximation of what they should be, but as themselves exactly without remainder. Jake called the marine mechanic from the next town over, a man named Denny, who arrived with a helper and a set of chain falls, and spent the better part of the next 2 days lowering the rebuilt engine into the well and connecting it up with the care that a man gives to work he considers important. When Denny was done, he fired the engine on the second turn of the key and stood back and listened to it idle and said, "She'll run for another 50 years if you maintain her," and Margaret believed him. Word had gone around Harwick the way Braddock had told her word went around small towns, which was to say through Ruth and through Denny and through the man at the fuel dock and through the guidance counselor at the school, who had by this point sent a 15-year-old named Wes to the Boathouse to meet Jake, and who had been bringing him out on Saturdays since early April. Word had gone that Arthur Holcomb's daughter was in town, and that the boat Arthur had been building for 30 years was being launched on a Saturday in late April, and that people were welcome. By 11 in the morning, there were more people on the gravel by the Boathouse than Margaret had spoken to cumulatively in her entire stay. Ruth was there with a brown bag under her arm that turned out to contain a bottle of champagne and a package of paper cups. Braddock was there in a clean shirt with the cuffs rolled up off duty, which he indicated by leaving his hat in his truck. Aldridge was there in the corduroy jacket with a scarf against the April chill. Jake was there with grease on his hands from a last-minute check on the engine connections, and Skipper was there at Jake's heel, moving between people and accepting their attention with the dignity of a dog that has earned its standing. Claire was there standing near the dock in a borrowed canvas coat of Ruth's that was too big through the shoulders, but which she wore without complaint. And at the far edge of the gathering, standing together by the tree line, were 2 men Margaret did not know. They were both older, one in his early 70s and one who might have been 80, and they had the bearing of men who were used to being recognized in certain rooms and had driven a long way this morning to be in this particular room, which was not a room at all, but a patch of gravel on a Maine lake in April. Braddock brought them over. The taller one, the younger of the 2, took Margaret's hand and held it. "Arthur restored a hacker craft for my father in 1991, he said. "My father sold it to me in 2006, and your father made me promise to bring her back for service every other year. He was the finest wooden boatman on this coast. He was the finest I knew of anywhere. I drove up from Boston this morning because I thought his daughter should know that, because I thought someone should say it out loud in a place where it mattered." Margaret held the man's hand and did not trust herself to speak. The older man, the one of perhaps 80, had a slight tremor in his hands and the careful, precise movement of someone who has learned to work around a body that has begun to work against him. He was holding a book, leather-bound, dark green, worn at the corners. He held it out to Margaret. "This is the log your father kept of every boat he worked on for me," he said. "There are 9 in there, from 1988 to 2019. Every job, every hour, every piece of material. He sent me copies after each job, and he kept the originals. I found the book in the mail 2 months after he passed, with a note from a lawyer in Harwick saying he had wanted me to have it." He paused. "I thought you should have it instead." Margaret took the book and held it against her chest with both hands and looked at the old man, and the old man looked back at her with the clear eyes that some very old people have, the eyes that have stopped trying to appear to be anything and simply are what they are. The launch itself was simple, in the way that the best things are simple, not because they require no effort, but because all the effort has already been expended in the preparation, and what remains is only the thing itself. Jake and Claire and Braddock and Margaret rolled the boat out of the loft on the wheeled dolly Jake had built for exactly this purpose, and eased it down the greased plank rails that ran from the wide front doors to the water. Ruth held the bowline. The 2 men from Boston steadied the gunwale, one on each side. Young Wes, the 15-year-old from the paper mill family, stood at the stern with his hands ready and his face showing nothing but his eyes showing everything. The boat went down the planks in the careful, controlled way that Jake had set up, everyone walking it together at the same pace, and at the end of the planks, where the water began, she went the last 6 feet on her own, sliding off the end of the rails and onto the surface with a sound that was less a splash than a sigh, the sound of a thing arriving at the place it was meant to be. She floated true, not a degree of list in either direction. The waterline sat exactly where Arthur's plans had placed it, which was where 35 years of experience had told him it should be. Margaret stood on the dock with the bowline in her hand and did not move. Claire came up beside her and took the line from her hand and tied it off on the dock cleat with a bowline knot that Margaret had taught her when she was 10 years old, and which she had apparently retained. She tied it cleanly and without fumbling and straightened up. "Your turn, Mom," she said. Margaret stepped down into the boat. The cockpit was small and clean, the teak grating firm under her boots, the mahogany surfaces warm from the morning sun. She stood in the cockpit for a moment and then sat down behind the wheel. The wheel was warm to the touch. She put both hands on it. Jake stepped down into the cockpit beside her and reached past her and turned the key. The engine coughed once and settled. The sound of it came up through the floorboards and through the soles of her boots and into her legs and into her chest, a low, even rumble that was not loud, but was complete, the sound of a thing working exactly as it was designed to work. Margaret looked at the lake. She put her hand on the throttle and moved it forward by a 1/4 inch. The boat lifted slightly at the bow and moved away from the dock in the slow, deliberate way of a heavy displacement hull, gathering its momentum, and the dock fell away behind them, and the boathouse fell away, and the shore fell away. And then there was nothing around them but the open water of Stillwater Lake, in April, gray-green and cold, and going away from them in every direction further than they could see. She got the feel of the wheel. She turned a slow, wide arc to the right, and then a slow, wide arc to the left. She brought her around and pushed the throttle a little further, and the bow came up another degree, and the hull settled into its running trim, and the sound of the engine changed from a rumble to a steady working tone, and the boat moved across the open water with a purpose that silenced every person still standing on the dock behind them. Claire was sitting behind her with one hand on the back of the seat and her face turned into the wind. Skipper was in the bow with his nose forward and his ears flat, his eyes half closed against the speed of the air, an old dog rediscovering something he had perhaps not felt in several years. Margaret ran her out to the middle of the lake and throttled back to an idle and sat with both hands on the wheel and looked at the far shore. The spruce along the far bank were showing the first faint green of new growth, a color so pale and tentative that you could mistake it for a trick of the light. The sky above them had gone from the flat gray of morning to a thin, high blue that let the sun through without quite committing to warmth. She sat there. After a while, she said without turning around, "She runs the way he said she would." Claire said, "How did he say she'd run, like she was supposed to?" Margaret said, She sat there a moment longer with both hands on the wheel and the engine idling and the lake going away from her in all directions. Then she said, "She needs a name." Claire was quiet behind her. Then she said, "What are you going to call her?" Margaret looked at the transom. She looked at her own name cut into the mahogany in her father's careful hand. She thought about the letter in the inside pocket of the coat she had been wearing the night she read it, the coat she had hung on the peg by the back door of the green-clapboard house and had not moved since. She thought about the line in the letter that had stopped her breath for a moment when she read it and had not stopped being true since. "I did not know how to be a father to an adult daughter when I was also learning to be a man without Eleanor." Eleanor, Margaret said, her mother's name. The name Arthur had stopped being able to say out loud easily after she died. The name Margaret had heard her father speak maybe a dozen times in 30 years, and never without the particular care of a man handling something that could break. The name he had written in his last letter, as if even there, even on paper, even in the knowledge that he was dying, the writing of it cost him something. "Eleanor," she said again. Claire did not say anything for a long moment. Then Margaret felt her daughter's hand come to rest on her shoulder and stay there. When they came back to the dock, Jake was waiting at the edge of it with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who has been looking at something for a long time and has finally seen it arrive where it was always going to arrive. Margaret told him the name. He nodded once, went up to the loft without being asked, and came back down with the smallest chisel, the one with the M on its sleeve, and he knelt on the dock beside the transom, and he worked for 20 minutes in silence, while the crowd stood back and waited without being asked to. When he stood up, he stepped aside. The transom carried two names now. For Margaret, above and below, it cut to the same depth and the same care in letters that matched the letters of her own name, in every particular of size and angle and finish, Eleanor. The wood between the two names was warm in the afternoon light. Margaret stood in front of the transom for a long time. She put her fingertip on the E of Eleanor and traced it slowly to the end of the name and then lowered her hand. She had spent the better part of her life thinking that her father had not loved her enough. Standing at the dock's edge in the April sun, with her daughter beside her, and the sound of the engine still faint in her memory, and her mother's name carved beneath her own in wood that had been warming in this loft for 35 years, she understood that the accounting had been wrong from the beginning. Not wrong because the distance had not been real. It had been real. Wrong because she had been measuring the wrong thing. She had been measuring his presence. She should have been measuring his preparation. Ruth had the champagne open by the time Margaret climbed up onto the dock, the cork removed with a practiced thumb rather than any dramatic gesture. She filled the paper cups and passed them around the gathering on the gravel, moving from person to person with the efficiency of someone who has been feeding and tending this community for long enough that she knows how to do it without being noticed doing it. She came to Margaret last and filled her cup and then raised her own. "To Eleanor," she said. To Eleanor, the people on the gravel said and drank. The crowd thinned through the afternoon. The two men from Boston drove south in a dark blue sedan. Denny the mechanic shook Margaret's hand and left. Aldridge made his way up the spur in his careful way. Braddock clapped Margaret once on the shoulder and said, "Welcome home, Maggie," and went to his truck. Margaret was coiling a length of new dock line when the sound of footsteps on the gravel made her look up. A woman was coming down the path from the spur, moving carefully in boots that were not quite right for the ground, carrying a child on her hip, and being followed closely by another child, a girl of about 6 in a pink coat that had been washed enough times to have softened the color to something nearer to salmon. The baby on her hip was in a knitted cap and was asleep. The woman herself was in her late 20s in a canvas jacket that was not warm enough for the day, and she had the look of someone who had rehearsed what she was about to say and was still not sure it was the right thing. She stopped a few feet from Margaret. "Are you Mrs. Holcomb?" "Margaret," she said. The woman looked at the ground for a second and then back at her. "My name is Amy Dunbar. I live in town. I was up at the top of the spur watching the launch with everybody else. I waited until they all left because I didn't want to bother you while people were still here." "It's no bother," Margaret said. She gestured to the two folding chairs at the edge of the dock. "Come and sit." She came and sat, setting the baby against her chest, the child still sleeping. The little girl in the pink coat went immediately to the edge of the dock and crouched down and looked at the boat with the focused interest of a 6-year-old who has found something she considers worth examining. Amy Dunbar told her story in the economical way of someone who has told it before and learned which parts matter. Her husband had been a timber cutter. He had been killed 14 months ago when a cable snapped on a logging rig on the ridge north of town. She had 2 children and a house she was renting month to month and 3 house cleaning clients in Harwick and a weekend job checking on the seasonal camps on the south end of the lake, which did not pay much because the camps were mostly empty until June. She was running short. She was a hard worker. She was sorry to ask. Ruth said you were kind, she said. I'm not looking for charity. I'm looking for work. Margaret looked at the boat tied to the dock. She thought about the summer ahead, the boats that Ruth had told her would come. If she put the word out, the customers Arthur had kept, and the customers who had tried to book with Arthur in his last years, and been turned away because he was not well enough. She thought about the boathouse and what it could hold and what it could do and what it needed to do those things properly. She thought about Amy Dunbar sitting across from her with a sleeping baby and a daughter crouching at the edge of her father's dock, looking at her father's boat. And she thought about what it meant to be a woman at 29 with 2 small children and no one to call. And she recognized the shape of it because she had stood in a version of that shape herself not very long ago, and the shape of it did not leave you quickly. Amy, she said, I'm going to need someone to run the administrative side of this operation this summer. Answering calls, keeping the books, dealing with walk-ins, scheduling the work orders, handling the correspondence. I'm setting up a small workshop here, and I need it to function like a business rather than a hobby. The pay is $15 an hour. There's a corner of the loft that I can set up as a proper workspace, and there's room for the baby. Both children come with you on the days you work. Amy looked at her. I'll need you to start Monday, Margaret said. She covered her face with her free hand. The hand was shaking. Amy. Margaret said it the way you say a name when you need someone to stop and be present for what you are saying. I need you to say yes. Yes, she said. Yes. Yes, ma'am. She set up the Arthur Holcomb Apprenticeship Fund the following Tuesday. Aldridge drew up the papers and had them ready for signature by noon. The fund was a charitable trust with an endowment drawn from a portion of the Spendthrift Trust, structured to pay a summer stipend of $3,000 to one young person from a struggling family in any of the 4 surrounding counties in exchange for 10 weeks of apprenticeship in classic wooden boat restoration under Jake Mercer's instruction. The first recipient was Wes, the 15-year-old from the paper mill family, whose guidance counselor had called Ruth 6 weeks earlier. Wes came to the boathouse on his first official morning with his hands in his pockets and his eyes moving over everything in the loft in the way that the eyes of a person who is good at making things move over a room full of tools, cataloging and assessing before any conversation has happened. Jake handed him the smallest chisel from the wooden box and showed him how to hold it. He showed him how the thumb controlled the blade and where the force came from and what you were listening for when the edge was right on the surface versus pressing too hard. Wes held the chisel and did not move for what might have been a full minute. He was not frozen. He was paying attention in the concentrated way of someone for whom this particular kind of attention came naturally and had not yet had a place to go. When Wes and his counselor left that afternoon, Jake turned to Margaret and said Arthur would have liked him. I know, Margaret said. You're doing a good thing here. I'm doing what my father did, Margaret said. Only out in the open. On a Sunday in late May, Margaret sat at the end of the dock in a folding chair with a mug in her hand and watched the people on the gravel behind her without turning around. She could hear them without looking. Claire was talking to Amy's daughter about something that had happened at school that week. Her voice patient and interested, the same voice she had used with small animals when she was a girl. Ruth was teasing Jake about a haircut Jake had gotten in town and was plainly dissatisfied with, and Jake was taking the teasing with the resigned good humor of someone who has been teased by this person before and has learned that enduring it is simpler than resisting it. Amy was sitting in one of the folding chairs with the baby against her chest and her eyes closed, doing the thing that mothers of small children do when someone else is there, and the baby is quiet and the moment permits it. which is to simply stop for a few minutes and let the stopping be enough. Skipper was on Margaret's foot. The boat was tied at the dock cleat 3 feet away, lifting and settling in the small even wake of the afternoon, the mahogany hull catching the late sun in long glowing bands that moved as she moved. The transom faced the dock. The two names were visible in the evening light. For Margaret above, Eleanor below. The wood between them warm in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. The wide swinging door of the boathouse, the one that had been bolted from the inside when Margaret first came down the gravel spur in March with the wrong key, and a folder from a dead man's filing cabinet, was propped open all the way. She had propped it open the morning after the launch and had not closed it since. The inside of the loft was lit with the afternoon sun coming through the south windows and the open door together. A double light that moved across the workbenches and the tool racks, and the neat rows of chisels in their chalk outlines, and the two cedar canoes hanging from the rafters. The whole building, which had been closed and leaning and locked against the world when she found it was open. Margaret sat with her mug and looked at it. She had come here in the dark of a January morning with 38 cents in a joint account and a forged signature on a closing packet and the address of a property she had never seen. She had come here with nowhere else to go and nothing particular to go toward. She had come here the way water goes downhill, not by decision, but by the simple operation of there being no other direction that made sense. And what had been here? Not what she had expected, not what she had been looking for, because she had not known what she was looking for until she found it. She had found a floor her father had built in silence over 30 years, and left for her without being asked and without being thanked, because he had not been thanked and had not waited for it. She had found a boat with her name in it, and a trust that could not be taken, and a letter that told her things she had needed to know for 30 years, and had not been ready to hear until this particular morning in this particular loft. She had found Jake, who had carried something forward that it would have been easy and understandable to leave behind. She had found Ruth, who had kept a promise to a dying man, and then made room for the dying man's daughter without being asked to do that either. She had found Braddock and Aldridge, and the woman at the diner, and the man at the general store, and the old men from Boston who drove 4 hours to say her father's name out loud, in a place where it mattered. She had found Wes, who held a chisel with the focused stillness of someone for whom this kind of attention is not effort, but nature. She had found Amy Dunbar, who had come down a gravel path with a sleeping baby and a daughter in a faded pink coat, and had asked for work with the particular dignity of a person who has had to practice asking for things they should not have to ask for, and has not let the practicing diminish them. She had found her daughter, who had driven 4 days from Denver and arrived with her grandfather's hands, and the patience of someone who has decided that what she is learning here is worth more than anything she left behind. Real family. Margaret thought, sitting at the end of her father's dock with the May sun on the water, and Skipper's weight on her foot, was not only the people you had made, or the people who had made you, it was also the people who had shown up in the right moment for no reason other than that the moment required it, and they were capable of answering. Some of those people, she understood now, had been showing up for years in ways she had not seen, building things in rooms she had not been in, keeping promises she had not known were made on her behalf. Her father had not abandoned her. He had been preparing for her. For 35 years in the only language he fully trusted, the language of wood and bronze and oiled tools laid in their chalk outlines. He had been saying the thing he could not say with his voice, the thing he had written finally on 3 sheets of yellow legal paper and left with a lawyer to give to her at exactly the right moment. The light on the lake went from gold to the pale rose of early evening. Across the water from somewhere deep in the spruce on the far shore, a loon called. The sound went out over the surface in the long wavering note that carries further on. Still water than any other sound Margaret knew. A sound that was lonely only if you heard it alone, and she did not hear it alone. A second loon answered from further down the shore, further than she could see in the fading light. And the two calls overlapped for a moment, and then separated and faded into the spruce in the darkening sky. Claire said something to Amy's daughter, and the girl laughed, and Ruth said something to Jake, and Jake said something back, and somewhere behind all of it, The baby made a small sound of stirring without waking, and Skipper sighed on Margaret's foot and resettled his chin on the dock plank. The boathouse door stood open to the lake. The boat lifted on the small evening wake and settled and lifted again. The two names on the transom caught the last of the light and held it for a moment. Her name and her mother's name together in the wood. Her father had spent his life working the only language in which he had ever been truly fluent, the only language in which he had ever told her the whole truth. She had spent 62 years thinking she had not been loved enough. She had been wrong. She had simply been loved in a language she had not yet learned to read. She knew how to read it now. Margaret Holcomb sat at the end of her father's dock in the last of the May light, and the boat moved gently on the water beside her, and the door of the boathouse stood open to the world, and she did not move, and she did not need to.